Welcome everyone to the fifth and final in a series of webinars on performance measurement in environmental compliance and enforcement. My name is Carl Brook, and I am the Managing Director of the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, INECE. This series of webinars is undertaken jointly by INECE and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we are lucky to have with us through the whole endeavor Michael Enns from Environment and Climate Change Canada and his colleagues. Following a series of targeted discussions on specific issues in performance measurement, today's webinar is going to take a step back and explore some of the key takeaways from the series of webinars. We'll also consider areas for future action. You should all have received a draft white paper that the INECE Secretariat developed that synthesizes the findings from the previous seminars, previous webinars. We are eager to receive your feedback on the draft white paper to ensure that people have an adequate opportunity to review the white paper. We will keep the comment period open through the end of this week so that people can send us any comments, edits, changes that they would like. At that point, the INECE Secretariat will finalize the white paper and share it with the network. Today's session will begin with a presentation by Ben Solomon-Schwartz, who will highlight some of the key takeaways from the past 4 presentations. We'll then have 2 sets of comments, first by Paul Ferraro of Johns Hopkins University, and then by Mike Enns of Environment and Climate Change Canada. In the discussion period following the presentations, we can hear from you, the participants, to learn which concepts and approaches you found most interesting and useful. In the second part of the discussion, we then seek your ideas on some concrete steps to improve performance measurement in compliance and enforcement. We greatly appreciate your continued dialogue and engagement in the series and look forward to your reflections on our discussions. I'd like to briefly introduce the 3 speakers and then do a round robin of the people who are online. The first presenter is Benjamin Solomon-Schwartz. He's the 2016-2017 Public Interest Environmental Law Fellow at the Environmental Law Institute. Prior to joining ELI, he clerked on the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia and also on the Massachusetts Appeals Court. Prior to law school, he worked as a land use planner in the city of Newton, Massachusetts. He holds a law degree from Harvard Law School and a master's degree in city planning from MIT. Dr. Paul Ferraro is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Business and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ferraro holds a joint faculty appointment in the Whiting School of Engineering and the Carey Business School. His research focuses on behavioral economics and the design and evaluation of environmental programs in the private and public sectors. Because these research areas are multidisciplinary and applied, he collaborates with scientists and engineers from a variety of social, natural, and physical science disciplines, as well as practitioners in the field. And Michael Enns is the Executive Director of Environmental Enforcement at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Since joining Environment and Climate Change Canada in 2009, Michael has served as a policy advisor to the Deputy Minister of Environment Canada, as well as a negotiator for the International Affairs Division. His expertise is in criminology, for which he received a master's degree from the University of Ottawa. And now I'd like to go around and ask people to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Anya Connectel. Sorry, I apologize if I misspoke your name. Anya?
Hello, yes, I'm Anya Connectel. I'm with International Institute for Sustainable Development.
Thank you. Cheryl Wasserman?
You're talking to me?
Yes. Could you just briefly introduce yourself? We're going around the table if you want.
Okay. Cheryl Wasserman, Environmental Governance Institute International, but 43 years retired from EPA, and we're the co-founders of INECE.
Thank you, Cheryl. Daniel Klaus?
Dan Klaus, EPA's Office of Compliance, Planning Matters Oversight Division.
Thank you. Daniel Palmer? Dan Palmer, are you there? Gandhi Singh. Gandhi? So Gandhi's still muted. She is an intern with INECE. Lawrence Baschak.
Group in Regina, Saskatchewan. My name is Lawrence Baschak with the Ministry of Environment, Government of Saskatchewan.
Sean Robinson, Ministry of Environment.
Tony Campbell, Minister of Environment.
Crystal Simeon, Ministry of Environment. Daphne Murphy.
Jeff Smith.
And Jeff Kaminsky.
Excellent. Glad you could all join us. Mark Pinchot. Mark, are you there? Nabil Haq. Looks like Nabil is muted.
Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay. My name is Nabil Haq. I'm currently a PhD student at Stony Brook University, formerly an environmental advisor for GIZ in Bangladesh.
Thank you. Noman Kadir. I don't think he's connected to speak. Tanya Shahjanian.
It's Tanya. I'm an intern at INECE.
And Timothy Nicholson.
Hi, it's Tim Nicholson in EPA's Office of Compliance.
Thank you all. And before we turn the floor over to Ben, I'd like to just provide a few technical notes. First, for those who are calling in by telephone, please note that in order to speak during the discussion portion, you'll need to connect your phone call to the webinar by clicking the link in the registration email and selecting the telephone option in the audio section of the control panel, and then dialing the audio pin that is provided. Second, if you have a question during the presentation or the comments that follow, please submit it to the chat function of the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll be sure to bring it up during the open discussion or to call on you to expand upon it. And third, the presentation portion of the webinar will be recorded and posted on the INECE website later for further viewing. The discussion portion will not be made public. Without further ado, Ben Solomon Schwartz.
Thanks, Carl, and good morning, everyone. So as Carl said, the goal of my presentation is to ground us by reviewing some of the discussions that occurred in the previous 4 webinars and to review some of the material that we put together in the draft white paper that was circulated. Hopefully, some of you had the opportunity to review that white paper, or will have the opportunity in the next few days to be able to submit feedback to us. And so I will review some of the material in there. I won't go through everything because it would take up all our time. And so today, I will review the previous material, synthesize some of the broad conclusions that emerged from the previous discussions, and then set the stage, hopefully, for not only the responses from Paul Ferraro and Michael Enns, but also the discussion that we'll all have afterwards. I mean, if you can go 2 slides forward. So to ground us again in the background for this series, we start from the perspective that agencies, particularly environmental compliance and enforcement agencies, face the challenge to how to measure the effect of their activities. And then a goal of this series was to engage with that question and to think about how to do so more effectively. Another key pillar of this discussion was that it's not always easy to extrapolate from data that is gathered in the course of environmental compliance and enforcement activities to actually constructing a narrative to make sense of whether those activities are effective, or how to figure out how to make them more effective, and then how to convey that information to other policymakers or members of the public or supervisors in the agency. Lastly, as background for the series, is the idea that new tools that are emerging and new data sources can help overcome those obstacles. But it's important to think critically about how to integrate those tools into the broader scheme of ways to measure the effectiveness of environmental compliance and enforcement activities. So we can go over one more slide. So to review the questions that were considered over the first 4 webinars in this series, we started with the first webinar led by Michael Enns of Environment Climate Change Canada about what to measure. And so a brief overview of that discussion first. It's important just to set the goals for what you want to achieve through environmental compliance and enforcement activities, and to use that as the starting point for thinking about how to measure the effectiveness of those activities. Because essentially, if you don't think about what the goals are in a very concrete and thought-through way, then it's difficult to figure out how to measure the effectiveness of those activities. A number of indicators are often gathered, or a set of information is gathered through the general course of environmental compliance and enforcement activities. Those include the number of enforcement actions. They include the number of violations. They may include the cost of those activities. And those numbers tell part of the story, but don't necessarily tell the whole story. And so it's important to think about how to gather additional information in order to both measure the effectiveness of the compliance and enforcement activities, and then how to guide those activities to the goals of the agency, whether the goals are targeting the most serious offenders or making sure to increase compliance rates across the nation or to target certain crimes. The data that is gathered can help guide activities of the agency. And so lastly, about what to measure question is the importance of focusing on gathering the full impact of enforcement actions. That goes from direct impact of compliance and enforcement activities to indirect impacts. Thinking about specific deterrence on the particular entity or regulated entity that is the subject of an enforcement action to general deterrence, the impact of compliance and enforcement actions on the broader regulated community. And lastly, thinking about spillover effects on other entities. So next, in the second session, I'll send the slide, we turn to how to measure. And the second webinar was led by Jay Shimshak of University of Virginia, and explored gathering data in a way to make performance measurements effective afterwards. And this key to this is to think about in advance of engaging in any performance, any compliance and enforcement activities, how we're going to use the data, how we're going to integrate that into a model for assessing the compliance and enforcement effectiveness, and then using that after the compliance activities to guide future activities. And it's important to choose a methodology that produces high quality data. And I'll return to this a bit later. Our third webinar was led by Michael Enns about integrating qualitative and quantitative approaches to assessing the effectiveness of compliance and enforcement activities. And we will return to this a bit later to think about how qualitative approaches can complement and integrate with quantitative data-based approaches to performance measurement. Lastly, in the fourth webinar, John Silverman and Ed Messina of US EPA led us through an analysis of next-generation compliance and enforcement tools, including things such as electronic reporting, and new technologies, mobile sensing, and other sorts of technologies that can be used in performance measurement as well. Let's go to the next slide. So, to review some of the information that was discussed in the white paper and that I alluded to before in a bit more detail, to start with, it's necessary to establish a performance measurement framework, to think about how you're going to integrate the data that you're gathering with the assessment of the compliance and enforcement activities. That begins with defining the scope of the problem, defining the scope of the environmental problems that are being addressed, and the use of different compliance and enforcement tools to address those harms. Next, it's necessary to choose the right metrics to measure performance. As I suggested before, certain metrics are easy because they naturally flow, easy to gather, or easier to gather because they naturally flow from the very nature of environmental compliance and enforcement activities, whether the number of enforcement actions or whether facilities are in compliance. But it's important to think about the link of causation from those metrics to what you're seeking to measure. That is, the number of enforcement activities will tell you how much activity the agency is doing, but it doesn't necessarily show directly whether the effectiveness of those activities. So it's important to look at additional metrics that can help illuminate not only what's going on, but also the effectiveness of those methods. And then it's necessary to think about a methodology for gathering and then analyzing the data to put together a picture of performance measurement and a picture of effectiveness. Lastly, it can be important to use both quantitative and qualitative approaches to assess the effectiveness of enforcement and compliance. And that can include data gathering and also can include surveys, surveys that can also ask members of the regulated community or other members of the public about the effectiveness and presence of environmental compliance and enforcement to attempt to build out a full picture of those activities. So, in gathering data, it's important to think about several attributes of data gathering. It's important to have data that's broad, that covers or can be used to assess a broad scope of the regulated community, data that's reliable, and data that's useful. When I talk about reliable, I mean data that the data means what it says, and you can use it to extrapolate to the activities of the regulated community, and then also the activities of the environmental compliance and enforcement agencies, and then can be useful in determining the effectiveness of those programs. So one source of data is self-reporting by members of the regulated community. And this has been facilitated in recent years greatly by the advent of various electronic reporting tools, some of which have been adopted by various EPA programs and programs in Canada and elsewhere. And studies have shown that even the fact of electronic reporting, rather than reporting by paper, has increased compliance in certain circumstances. But it's also important to note, in terms of self-reporting, how to ensure the quality of that data. And that means two basic things. One, to ensure there aren't mistakes, accidental mistakes, that enter into the data by the members of the regulated community, and also to ensure that there aren't, intentional mistakes of misreporting by members of the regulated community. So there are various ways to ensure data quality, including third-party monitoring, back checks through inspections or activities directly engaged by the compliance and enforcement agency, as well as monitoring by citizens, and the use of sort of citizen science, citizens that can engage directly in monitoring their environment has increased greatly in recent years and is proving to be an important tool towards adding to the picture of what's happening in terms of the results of activities of members of the regulated community and the results of compliance and enforcement activities. So next I want to turn to various methods of data analysis. So once you've gathered the data, there are different ways to assess it. And now it's important to say that you can't just start analyzing the data after the fact. It's important to think about from the beginning what you're going to do with the data, why you're collecting it, how you're collecting it, and whether it's going to yield some sort of useful result. So I don't want to suggest that this happens only at the end of the process. And so there are several different pathways for analyzing data that you gather. One is to set up randomized controlled trials, and Professor Shimshak talked about the use of these trials in depth in his second webinar, and also talked about how there are different types of control trials you can engage. One type would be comparing a set of inspections versus a set of members of the regulated community that don't have an inspection. That may be possible in certain circumstances. It also could yield political difficulties if there's concern about intentionally choosing not to conduct inspections. But in a world where there's limited resources, adding some constraints to how the inspections are assigned through certain randomization may be a way to yield additional data that can be used to assess the effectiveness of particular techniques. Another option for randomized control trials is to use different enforcement and compliance methodologies. So that is, you don't have to compare an inspection versus no inspection, but you might compare different methods of providing information back to the members of the regulated community, whether sending them a letter or engaging in about their activities or engaging in enforcement actions, and you could learn about the effectiveness of different compliance and enforcement activities. And another methodology is to use regression analysis and other statistical techniques to assess the effectiveness of different inspection and enforcement compliance activities that are already being carried out. That is to say, not intentionally changing those activities, but looking at the data that you gather about them in order to sort out what is the causal effects of the different enforcement compliance activities. And it's essential to try to sort out the other variables that might be happening in the world at large from the activities of the agency. And lastly, I just want to turn to the growing importance of transparency and sharing of data with members of the public. That itself can turn into a way to tell the story of the impacts of enforcement and compliance activities, of environmental regulation, and then to build support for those activities. So just to recap, a few conclusions that came out of this series of webinars, a few conclusions that have come to us in synthesizing the material in the white paper. One is that measuring performance is not just about producing data. It's not about generating numbers. We're trying to tell a story. Telling a story about the impact of the regulated activities and telling a story about the activities of compliance and enforcement personnel and agencies. And that story can be used both with public, with members of legislature, political actors, as well as supervisors within agencies. And it's critical to tell that story if you want to build support for new activities or support for continued environmental compliance and enforcement activities. Second, as I said before, that conventional indicators may yield part of the picture, but a misleading story if they're not complemented with other data that can be gathered intentionally in order to yield a story of performance measurement. Third, that it's essential to have a clear idea of the goals and context for compliance and enforcement activities from the very beginning of the process. And to think about what data is going to be gathered, what is the point of gathering that data, what can be done with it afterwards in order to strategically guide a program. And fourthly, to return to talk about new technologies, often talked about as next generation technologies. Those can facilitate more accurate performance measurement and the use of that. But it's not enough just to have those technologies in place, but they have to be thought about in the same context as the other aspects of performance measurement. What are the goals? What is the use of that data? And having that be integrated to a performance measurement scheme. So lastly, I would just leave us with some questions for further discussion. And again, after some responses from Michael Enns and Paul Ferraro, some of the discussion portion, and we're really interested from all of you, what are some of the important conclusions that you've taken away from this series? Conclusions that I might not have emphasized, that we might not have emphasized in the white paper. That's really why we want feedback at this point in the process. And second, what are some actions that can be taken by INECE, by members of this series, people that are participating in the series, by different agencies, to build on the conversations that we've had over these 5 webinars. And with that, I will turn it back to Carl.
Thank you very much, Ben. And before we open it up for discussion by the various attendees, we'd like to have some remarks first by Paul Ferraro at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ferraro, the floor is yours. I think we're ready to go there.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right, great. I'm just going to make sure my computer doesn't do anything funny when I go to full screen. It probably will. Let me just make it go back to its full screen. All right. So you can still see me and my full screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for having me. I'll spend fewer than 10 minutes. I'll put a timer on, make sure academics have a tendency to run at the mouth. I just want to make 3 points that sort of reflect some things that have already been said and a couple of things I thought were missing from the summary document. Just for people to know, my background focuses on behavioral change, which enforcement and compliance is definitely focused on, and inferring impacts of different programs, policies, or variations in programs and policies. So I just want to make 3 points. One that's been pointed out is know how you're going to use your measurements. There's a lot of emphasis on how do we collect data and measurements without thinking clearly on how you're going to use them. That often leads to problems down the line. That when you're thinking about, are we effective, are we having an impact, it's really important to formulate clearly the theory that underlies your intervention or your change in the intervention. That's going to point to what data to collect and how to infer whether you're having an impact or not. And then I want to talk just briefly about how do we accumulate knowledge, right? So if people are finally bringing up evidence, developing evidence about whether things are working or not, how do we accumulate or synthesize that evidence? What are other fields doing and what that we can learn from? So I just want to talk about the first point about in terms of measurement. There's only 3 reasons that we generally measure things. One is a descriptive, describe the current conditions. Second is to set benchmarks and monitor progress towards them. When people talk about performance measurement, performance management, this is typically what they're talking about. We want to reduce compliance violations by a certain percentage, then we monitor and see our progress toward that. And the third, which is different, is inferring our impacts. We might see that violations are going down or going up over time, but it's not the same as inferring whether what we're doing is making them go up or go down over time. And in the environmental community, we tend to be good at monitoring status and trends of indicators, emissions, compliance, violations, penalties. We're not very good at inferring what factors are affecting those status and trends. Like, are we reducing emissions or violations? And that second question takes a sort of a different approach to getting at the question of, are we having any impact? And it's really important to try to embed in our institutions a culture of experimenting, of posing questions, asking, could I do something better than what we're doing now? We're doing plan A now. Would plan B would be a better way of doing enforcement. And that takes having a theory, right? And this is a diagram where we sort of try to lay out for legally protecting ecosystems. So this is a slightly different context, but it still has enforcement, community participation, education involved in it. And it's a very simplistic diagram that starts to sketch out why do we think doing this activity is going to lead to changes in ecological conditions. And the same thing would happen if you're in the water context, the air context. Fleshing out what's often called the theory of change or often causal pathways is really an important exercise because it points to what data you ought to be collecting, and it points to how am I going to infer whether we're having an impact or not. So that's a really important step that often gets ignored, is to sit down and say, okay, I have this new idea that community science is going to affect air emissions. Exactly how, what are all the steps through which that is likely to take place? What do I think is going to happen? And what does that imply about data that I might collect and how I'm going to infer whether there are impacts or not? And then another important step is trying to test directly these ideas, embedding tests into our programs. We're not very good at that. I saw that Jay Shimshak talked about randomized controlled trials, and often the reaction is, that's really complicated, we don't do experiments. And I always say, yeah, you do. Actually, every time you decide to change a program or introduce something new, you're running an experiment. The problem is that it's uncontrolled, and therefore it's really hard to learn something from that experiment. And I think what Jay talked about is that you often have the power to vary how you implement rules and your enforcement activities. You do have the authority to treat people, business, and facilities differently. You already do often. You think you have different targeting mechanisms or priorities, different groups, subsectors need different sorts of approaches. And if you actually decide to, when you roll it out, to do your new idea that we're going to give more transparency to civic organizations or river keepers, or we're going to try a different targeting approach, or we're going to reduce the complexity of the paperwork, or we're going to e-reporting, you can often roll these out in a way that you can actually learn more from them. And I saw in your summary document, you said that these randomized controlled trials are logistically challenging. Having done them with, I work with U.S. Department of Agriculture, EPA, nonprofit organizations, the actual experiment is not logistically challenging typically. What is measuring the outcomes or measuring the process indicators across that causal pathway. But any kind of performance management system has to collect these data. That often is what's difficult, is collecting the data, not doing the experiment itself. And I want to point out that I'm actually involved right now in a large-scale experiment funded by the United Kingdom in 6 different countries where we're testing whether community monitoring can lead to changes in water quality, how people are managing common pool resources. And this can be done, but we just need to think about it before we roll things out. All right, so synthesis. How do we go about, as we start developing information, as we start testing things in our programs, how do we go about accumulating knowledge that we can all draw on? And there's generally 2 ways. And one of them I want to point out is a really great example that comes from the education context. It's called the What Works Clearinghouse, funded by the Department of Education in the United States, run by Mathematica. And they basically screen for high quality pieces of evidence. So those kinds of experiments or really good regression studies, quasi-experimental analyses for all different sorts of outcomes that people might care about in the education. And they explain what's the evidence base, what do we know about the context in which this seems to work, what moderates its effects. And this not only gives practitioners a way to figure out what's going on and to sift through all the different studies, some of which might be good and some of which might be poor, but it also induces better evidence collection, because in the beginning they often called this clearinghouse the what doesn't work clearinghouse, because there was hardly any good quality evidence on lots of things that people were interested in. And if you don't want to go for something that sophisticated, you can go for something that's a little bit less in depth. And here's an example from the enforcement, not environmental enforcement, but law enforcement more generally, from the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy that tries to summarize the evidence and give you a sense of what do we know and how high is that quality about what we know. And a more ambitious initiative is to do systematic reviews, and for lots of different governments and within the U.S. and Canada outside the environmental domain, agencies are funding these systematic reviews. They're more than just literature reviews. They're essentially a form of research that will have very transparent steps in how they go about screening for studies, and they're attempting to minimize bias and error. So they're really focusing on evidence quality. They're often excluding a large amount of the academic literature, the practitioner literature, because the quality is not very good, and they focus on what do we know from the high quality stuff, what do we know from the low quality, and make it really clear to the reader how much trust you can have in particular results. In medicine, the Cochrane collaboration is a leader in these systematic reviews. Social science has something called the Campbell collaboration, that's more education, criminal justice. There is one for the environment called the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, but it tends to focus on natural resource. It doesn't really have much in terms of enforcement, but that could change with enough coordination across the institutions that are interested in this. I'll skip that and I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time. I guess I should stop sharing my screen. So let's see.
Thank you, Paul. That was really fantastic and quite succinct. So before opening up, I'd like to turn it to Mike Enns, who has been conceptualized this series and has been central to the implementation of it. Mike, I think, yeah, you are now unmuted. The floor is yours.
Okay, so you can hear me, Carl?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks both to Ben for a really good summary and also to Paul for an excellent presentation. I have to admit, as Paul was talking, I was furiously taking notes there. That was a very enlightened presentation, and I hope it'll be made available online because I'd certainly like to study it in more depth. So I was thinking back, Carl, this morning to our discussion that we had to launch this presentation and how we talked about the fact that you know, the way of measuring performance as it applies to anything enforcement related is kind of grown a little long in the tooth, in the classical sense, right? So you know, the counting of enforcement measures, the counting of penalties, and using those essentially to infer results without really any critical analysis underlying it, is still the standard practice in a lot of ways. And the weaknesses of it are really well known, but there's a lack of a sort of forward movement in a lot of places to address those things. And it was on that basis, I think, that we agreed that this conversation over the 5-part series that you launched would be good, and I think it's done significant things to advance that discussion, at least in my own mind. So I thought what would be useful is for me to lay out the things that made the most sense to me, and that probably have the most relevance for how we run our organization here and the changes that I would like to make in part as a result of the conversations we had. So one of the very first things that struck me was the nexus that exists between technology and what to measure. And so in enforcement of environmental regulations, the basic model that's existed in my mind for at least the last 10 or 15 years is the notion that the crafting of regulations ought to result in the pushing out of the measurement of results and the monitoring of performance to the regulatees themselves, and that government ought to be risk-based monitors of that monitoring process that regulatees themselves are engaged in. And I think in my mind that model has kind of done as much as it can to protect the environment and to advance environmental enforcement. I think it's technology that allows us to move beyond that, right? So as a public servant with a limited budget, right, I have to think about where to focus my monitoring efforts, but I can, with certain kinds of technology, I can disperse that monitoring in very significant ways and even get real-world data about the impact of certain activities on the environment. And as a result, I can remain in a management role over how that monitoring is done, having not dispersed it to third parties, and still stay within my budget. And I think that can fundamentally change the way that we do performance measurement. And I thought we had good conversations about that. And I really, for my part, believe that that is what's going to make a big difference over the next 10 years, is the introduction into that technology that allows real-world monitoring, but more importantly, the way that it will change how we envision monitoring and enforcement from a drafting of regulatory standpoint. Something else that I wanted to mention that I think was really telling for me was the discussion around the integration of qualitative measurement. So I think intuitively a lot of us understand that telling the story and understanding the impact of what we do involves moving beyond quantitative measures to actually talking to regulatees and to people about the impact of these policies on their day-to-day activities, etc. But it's not integrated, I think, into most organizations that I deal with in a meaningful way. And it's not integrated into my own in a meaningful way. And the challenges, I think, really came to fore in the discussion on this was just the sheer difficulty in finding people that are capable of doing this kind of analysis in an artful but systematic and meaningful way. Not everybody can do this work, and to find them is difficult, and then you have to continually invest in them. And then you also have to make that part and parcel of your models from the get-go. You know, and Paul was talking about the need to hypothesize about what it is that what you think will reduce crime, and then to test that at several points through a meaningful set of measurements that you do in the right way. For my part, I learned about the role of qualitative measures in there, and the need to have that as an integrated part of your planning from the get-go. I think the third thing that I'll mention in the last is the need to think about the scope of what it is that you're trying to measure. I think for my own part, what I've seen is a lot of people actually trying for too large a scope in their performance measurement. They want to look at the impact of their organization, of an entire line of policy, an entire approach, rather than going down to this sort of medium level and looking at what it means, you know, in specific locations in the country, in specific regions of the country, but also what it means at various points within your own organization. So what does it mean for the way that officers are applying the law and making use of their discretion? What does a new policy mean? How has it changed that? And then what has that meant for interactions between officers and regulatees? What has that meant for the overall understanding of regulatory responsibilities amongst citizens? Each of those points in time and each of those interventions needs to be monitored, I think, in a way that produces data. And it's at that level that I think that we miss it. We miss things sometimes in how we do things. And that was a big takeaway for me. So there were many more takeaways, Carl, but those are the three that I wanted to highlight. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to you and hear what others have to say.